The wind howled across the open prairie, carrying with it the chill of evening. The sun had begun to sink behind the rolling hills, staining the horizon with shades of orange and red. Out in the middle of the tall grass, far from any road or homestead, a sound rose above the whistling breeze, a baby's cry. It wasn't the soft whimper of a restless child, but the desperate wail of hunger and fear. Bent low beside that infant was a young woman. Her clothes were tattered from travel, her face pale with exhaustion, and her eyes red from sleepless nights. She clutched at her stomach, weak from going without food herself, while her child screamed helplessly in the grass. She whispered broken promises to the baby. "Hush now, just a little longer. Mama's trying, baby, Mama's trying." But there was no milk left in her and no food in her satchel. The prairie stretched out endlessly around them, offering no comfort, no shelter, no hope. Then from a distance the soft clop of hooves broke the silence. A lone cowboy rode across the plains, reins loose in his hand, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the fading sun. His horse slowed when the man's sharp ears caught the faint sound of crying. He tugged the reins, listening again, and this time he was certain. Someone was out there, someone in trouble. Guiding his horse toward the sound, he soon spotted them. A woman collapsed in the grass, and a baby beside her, flailing tiny arms and screaming for life. The cowboy's heart clenched. He swung down from his horse without hesitation, his boots crunching the dry grass. The woman's weary eyes flicked up at him, startled, fearful but too weak to move. The cowboy knelt beside the child. Without a word, he slipped off his worn coat, the only layer keeping the chill away from his own bones, and gently wrapped it around the tiny body. The baby's cries softened just a little, comforted by the warmth. The man gathered the child in his arms, cradling it close. The woman tried to push herself up, her voice trembling. Don't touch him," she whispered, but her words lacked strength. She wasn't resisting out of anger, only from pride and fear. She didn't know this man. She didn't know if he meant harm or help. The cowboy looked her in the eyes, steady and calm. His voice was low, reassuring. "Ma'am, your little one's cold. Let me help." Tears welled up in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. For days she had been fighting alone, and now here stood a stranger, holding her child as though it were his own. She wanted to trust him, but trust was dangerous. And yet something in his rough voice, steady, honest, unshaken, made her chest ache with relief. The prairie was vast, empty, and merciless. But at that moment, with the baby wrapped in the cowboy's coat and his strong arms holding steady, the hopeless silence of the land felt just a little less cruel. The woman's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself against the grass. Her arms trembled with the effort of reaching out, but she could barely lift them. She watched with wide, wary eyes as the cowboy cradled her baby. Every instinct screamed at her to pull the child back, yet her body was too weak to obey. The cowboy adjusted the coat around the tiny bundle, tucking it snug beneath the baby's chin. He rocked gently, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and the child's shriek softened into hiccuping sobs. The sound was enough to make the woman's throat tighten. For the first time in hours, maybe days, her baby wasn't crying in pure desperation. "You've been out here long?" the cowboy asked, his voice carrying that calm steadiness again. He didn't look at the woman harshly, nor with pity, but with the quiet patience of a man used to hardship. The woman's lips parted, but her words caught in her dry throat. She coughed, swallowed hard, and whispered, 2 days, maybe more. I lost track." The cowboy nodded once, glancing at her cracked lips and pale face. He set the baby carefully in the crook of his arm and dug into his saddlebag. After a moment, he pulled out a small canteen and crouched down beside her. "Here," he said simply, holding it out. Her pride flared, and she shook her head weakly. "I can manage," but the cowboy didn't move the canteen away. His gaze met hers, firm but kind. "Ma'am, you don't look like you can manage much more. Take a sip. That little one needs you steady on your feet." Her chest ached at his words. For so long she had fought to appear strong, for her baby, for herself. Yet here, in the middle of nowhere, there was nothing left to pretend with. Her hand shook as she reached out and took the canteen. The water was cool, metallic, and sweeter than anything she had tasted in days. As she drank, the cowboy pulled a small piece of jerky from his pack and tore it into smaller strips. He handed one to her with quiet insistence. She hesitated again, then finally accepted. The meat was tough, but to her starving body it was salvation. The baby whimpered softly, tiny fists waving in the air. The cowboy shifted his coat tighter and bent low, murmuring words the woman couldn't hear. Whatever he said, the baby responded by settling, eyes fluttering as if sleep might finally come. The sight broke her. Tears slipped down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. She had tried so hard, walked so far, and failed at every turn. And now this stranger, this dusty cowboy with calloused hands and tired eyes, had given her child what she could not. Comfort. Why? "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice barely above the wind. The cowboy looked at her for a long moment, then down at the baby in his arms. His jaw tightened, and for a second he seemed to weigh his words. Finally he said softly, "Because no child should cry from hunger in the grass. Not while I've got strength left to help." The woman pressed her hand to her mouth, sobbing silently. She wanted to argue, to push him away, to cling to the pride that had carried her this far. But instead she let the tears fall and whispered, "Thank you." The prairie stretched wide and empty around them. But for the first time since her journey had begun, she didn't feel completely alone. The cowboy eased himself down onto the grass, keeping the baby swaddled in his coat. His horse grazed nearby, reins loose as though it too sensed the stillness of this fragile moment. The woman sat hunched a few feet away, clutching the canteen he had given her, her shoulders trembling from the effort of holding herself upright. For a long while, the only sounds were the steady breathing of the baby and the rustle of the tall prairie grass. The cowboy didn't press her with questions. He simply let the silence stretch, giving her the space to speak if she chose. "Finally she did. I thought I could make it to town," she murmured, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "There was supposed to be a settlement, maybe a day's walk north, but the river ran dry and I lost the trail. I've been wandering in circles." Her gaze dropped to the baby, who now slept peacefully against the cowboy's chest. Her lips quivered. "He hasn't eaten properly in 2 days. I didn't know what else to do. I just laid him down for a moment. I thought maybe someone would hear us." The cowboy's jaw tightened as he listened. He could picture the miles of empty prairie she had crossed, the hopeless search for shelter, the gnawing hunger that must have followed her every step. He thought of the baby, left crying in the grass, and the desperation it took for a mother to believe that might be her last chance. "Where's his father?" the cowboy asked gently, her face crumpled at the question. She looked away, staring into the fading light. "Gone," she whispered. "He promised us a better life. Promised he'd find work out west. But when the hardships came, he left. Said he'd send for us." She shook her head, tears streaking the dirt on her cheeks. "I stopped waiting." The cowboy's hand tightened slightly around the baby, though his expression remained calm. He had seen men like that before, men who rode off chasing fortune and left their families in the dust. His stomach burned at the thought, but he kept his voice steady. "You've been carrying the weight alone," he said quietly. She laughed bitterly, a sound more like a sob. "Carrying? I've been drowning. Every mile, every day, I tell myself I can do it, that if I just keep walking, I'll find safety for him. But I haven't eaten enough to stand. I can't even keep him warm." Her hand covered her face. "I'm failing him." The cowboy shifted, leaning forward slightly. "No, ma'am. You're still here. You didn't give up even when it felt hopeless. That baby's alive because of you." The woman lowered her hand slowly, meeting his eyes. There was no pity in his expression, only a quiet certainty that steadied her more than water or food ever could. For the first time, she allowed herself to take a full breath. Her baby wasn't alone anymore. And perhaps for just a moment, neither was she. The fire of dusk painted the prairie in deep shadows. The cowboy shifted the baby gently into the crook of his arm, rocking with the patience of a man who had handled colts and cattle all his life. The woman sat across from him, knees drawn tight against her chest, her face half hidden in her arms. Silence hung between them, heavy as the darkening sky. She was grateful. She knew she was. Her baby was breathing steady, wrapped in warmth, finally resting. But along with the relief came something sharp and unwelcome. Shame, pride, the bitter taste of failure. Her voice broke the stillness. Low and trembling, but edged with steel. "I don't want your charity." The cowboy looked up, his weathered face calm, unreadable. "Ain't charity," he said softly. "It's common decency. You and that little one need help. I got 2 hands and a horse. That's all there is to it." She shook her head fiercely, though her body trembled from the effort. "If I let you help me now, then what am I? A mother who can't even feed her own child? A woman so weak she has to depend on the mercy of strangers?" Her words cut sharp, not just at him but at herself. She turned away, staring into the grass as if she might disappear into it. The baby stirred at her raised tone, and the cowboy instinctively hushed the little one, patting the tiny back until the child settled again. "Mom," he said after a long pause, his voice deep and steady, "you're not weak. You're still breathing, still fighting. That baby's alive because you kept moving when most folks would have laid down and quit. But she couldn't accept it. Not yet. Her whole life since her husband's leaving had been one long battle to prove she didn't need anyone, to prove she could carry on. And here, one evening on the prairie, all her walls were crumbling at the touch of a stranger's hands and the comfort of his coat, her fists clenched in the grass. "You'll ride away tomorrow," she whispered. "Men always do. And then I'll be back where I started, alone." The cowboy's jaw tightened at her words, a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. He knew the truth in what she said. Too many men had ridden off, too many families had been left behind in the dust. But he also knew he wasn't those men. He didn't argue. Instead, he laid the baby gently back in her arms, tucking the coat around both mother and child. "Then tonight," he said quietly, "you're not alone." The woman froze at the unexpected weight of the child against her chest, her baby snuggled close, soothed by warmth, by the lingering scent of the cowboy's coat. Tears stung her eyes again. She wanted to believe him, but believing was dangerous. Trust was dangerous. And yet, in that fragile silence, with the prairie stretching endlessly around them, something inside her shifted. For the first time in a long while she felt seen. The prairie night had settled in, colder and darker than the woman had expected. The stars stretched wide above them, scattered diamonds across a velvet sky, but their beauty offered little comfort. A sharp wind swept through the grass, rattling the dry stalks like bones, and the woman shivered even with the cowboy's coat around her shoulders. The cowboy sat close by, quiet and watchful, feeding small sticks into a fire he had built from what little dry kindling he could gather. Its glow was meager against the vast emptiness, but it kept the chill at bay. The woman tried to sleep, her baby curled against her chest, but unease pricked at her mind. She had seen too much, lost too much to let her guard down fully. The cowboy, however, didn't rest. His ears were tuned to the sounds of the night, the shifting of the grass, the whistle of the wind. And then he heard it, a sound out of place, low, guttural. A growl carried faintly on the breeze. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle lying beside him. He rose slowly, careful not to startle the woman. "What is it?" she whispered, sitting upright, clutching her baby tighter. He tilted his head, listening. The growl came again, this time closer. Then another and another, shadows moving in the tall grass. The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Wolves," he muttered. Her eyes widened with terror. "No, not here. They're hungry," he said flatly, chambering around in his rifle. "And we're easy pickings." The woman's breath hitched. She pulled the baby closer, heart pounding so loud she thought the wolves must hear it. The cowboy stepped forward, placing himself between her and the approaching danger, his boots planted firm in the dirt. The growls grew louder, circling now, the sound of paws rustling in the grass. The firelight flickered across the night, catching glints of eyes, yellow, unblinking. One wolf stepped into the open, teeth bared, saliva dripping from its jaws. The woman stifled a scream. The cowboy raised his rifle slowly, his breathing steady, eyes locked on the predator. "Stay behind me," he said calmly. Then he fired. The crack of the gun split the night, echoing across the plains. The wolf yelped and vanished into the shadows, but the others did not scatter. If anything, they grew bolder, growling and circling tighter. The cowboy loaded again, quick and practiced, his eyes scanning the dark. "They're testing us," he muttered, "waiting for us to break." The woman's hands shook violently as she clutched her baby. "What do we do?" "You keep that little one quiet," he said firmly. "I'll handle the rest." 2 more wolves lunged from the grass, snapping jaws glinting in the firelight. The cowboy swung the rifle like a club, striking one across the muzzle. The other closed in, but he kicked hard, sending it sprawling back with a yelp. His horse reared in alarm, hooves striking the ground, but didn't bolt, loyal, trained, standing its ground. The woman could hardly breathe. She had never seen such calm in the face of terror. He moved with precision, each motion measured, every decision sharp. Another wolf charged, and this time the cowboy fired again, the shot ringing out clear. Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the whimper of wounded animals retreating into the dark. The pack lingered at the edges, growling, but the fire's light and the man's unshaken stance kept them at bay. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the growls faded into the distance. The prairie grew quiet once more, as though the danger had never been there at all. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his shoulders finally relaxing. He turned to the woman whose eyes brimmed with tears, her baby pressed tightly against her chest. "They're gone," he said simply. She stared at him, breathless. "So you saved us." He shook his head, crouching by the fire again. "I did what had to be done." That's all, but she couldn't look away. In those frantic moments, she had seen something more than just survival. She had seen strength she hadn't known existed, courage that didn't falter even when surrounded. And for the first time since her husband had left, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It wasn't just relief. It was trust. The cowboy caught her staring, and for a moment silence stretched between them again, different now, heavier, filled with something unspoken. He glanced away, feeding another stick into the fire. "You and the baby ought to sleep," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." She nodded slowly, her heart pounding, her pride breaking in ways she never imagined. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to rest, not because she was strong enough to fight, but because someone else was willing to fight for her. And in that fragile surrender, as the baby's breathing steadied against her chest, a new chapter quietly began. The dawn broke soft and golden over the prairie, spilling light across the grassland like a blessing. The fire had burned low, little more than embers now, but it had carried them safely through the night. The woman stirred first, her baby nestled quietly against her chest. For the first time in days, the child was not crying. She blinked sleep from her eyes and turned to where the cowboy still sat, rifle resting across his knees, eyes steady on the horizon. His hat brim shadowed his face, but she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his jaw. He hadn't slept. "Not once. You stayed awake all night?" she asked softly. He turned, gave a small nod. "Wolves don't always give up the first time. Someone had to keep watch." Her throat tightened. She had known men who boasted of strength, who puffed up their chests with loud promises. But this man had shown it in silence, without asking for thanks. The baby stirred, whimpering softly. She hushed him gently, brushing her hand across his small head. "He's hungry again," she murmured, shame pricking her voice. "But I have nothing left to give." The cowboy stood, walked to his saddlebags, and returned with a small cloth bundle. Inside were strips of dried jerky, a bit of bread, and a tin of beans. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You eat," he said, setting it down before her. "Strength for you means strength for him." Her lips parted in protest. "But it's your food. You'll go hungry." He shook his head firmly. "Don't argue. A baby don't stand a chance if his mama falls." Tears stung her eyes as she picked up the bread with trembling hands. It wasn't the taste that overwhelmed her. It was the thought behind it. For so long she had faced the world alone, clutching survival with both fists. To have someone place food before her, to think first of her and her child. It was more kindness than she had known in years. She broke off a piece, chewed slowly, and for the first time felt strength seep back into her limbs. The cowboy busied himself with the fire, pouring beans into a small tin pot to warm them. He worked with practiced motions, like a man who had cooked over countless campfires. The smell filled the air, rich and hearty, and soon he was offering her more. "Eat," he said again, his voice quiet but steady. And she did, bite after bite, until she was full in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. The baby fussed less in her arms, soothed by the warmth of her body and the comfort of her steady heartbeat. When the meal was done, the woman looked at the cowboy across the flickering embers. "Why are you helping us?" she asked finally, the question that had burned in her mind since the moment he had picked them up from the grass. He met her gaze without hesitation. "Because no one else did." The simplicity of the answer struck her harder than anything else could have. He wasn't helping for reward or recognition or pride. He was helping because it was right. Her lips trembled. I don't know how to thank you. "You don't need to," he said gently. "Just keep going." "That's thanks enough." Silence stretched, but it was not the tense silence of strangers anymore. It was something softer, comfortable. As the day wore on, they traveled together, the cowboy leading his horse while she rode carefully with her baby in her arms. He taught her little things along the way. How to tie a cloth sling to carry the child against her chest so her hands were free. How to spot rabbit tracks in the dirt. How to listen for the rustle of quail in the grass. Each lesson was small, but to her it felt like the world opening for the first time. She had always believed survival meant suffering, meant tightening her jaw and pushing through pain. But with him, survival looked different. It looked like learning, like sharing burdens. That night, when they stopped again, he showed her how to build a fire herself. Her hands fumbled at first, clumsy and unsure, but he guided her patiently, his voice calm, his hands steady as they adjusted hers. Finally, the spark caught, and a small flame danced to life. She stared at it in wonder, a smile breaking across her face for the first time in what felt like forever. "I did it," she whispered. He gave a small smile in return, tipping his hat. "Told you you could." The baby gurgled in her arms as if sharing in the triumph, and for a moment the heaviness of her world seemed to lift. Later, as the fire warmed them and the stars wheeled overhead, she looked at the cowboy again, and this time she did not see just a stranger. She saw a protector, a teacher, a man who had stepped into a place where no one else had, and begun to fill the emptiness she thought could never be touched. Something deep inside her shifted that night, not just trust, but hope. And with hope came the faintest glimmer of something she had buried long ago, the belief that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. The journey stretched on for several days, each step of the horse carrying them further from the place of despair, where the cowboy had first found the woman and her baby. With every mile, she felt her old life fading behind her like a shadow, while something new and unfamiliar began to grow ahead, a fragile sense of safety. By the fourth evening, the prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with oaks and cottonwoods. The cowboy slowed his horse and pointed. "There," he said quietly. Nestled in a hollow was a small homestead, a sturdy cabin of rough-hewn logs, a barn leaning but strong, smoke rising from the chimney. To the woman it looked like heaven itself. "Is this yours?" she asked, her voice hushed. He gave a small nod. "Built it with my own hands after the war. Ain't much, but it's home." Her throat tightened. She had no claim to such a place, no right to the warmth it promised. "I can't stay here," she whispered. "You've done enough already. I have nothing to give you in return." The cowboy dismounted, tied the reins, and came to her side. His eyes were steady, kind, but firm. "Don't talk like that. You and that baby need shelter. A roof, food, you'll have it here for as long as you want it." Tears stung her eyes. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died when she saw the truth in his face. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a chance. He helped her down, steadying her as her weary legs touched the ground. The baby whimpered, stirring against her chest, but quieted again when she rocked him gently. Together they walked toward the cabin. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and pine. It was simple. One room, a stone hearth, a rough table, a bed tucked in the corner. Yet to her it felt more than enough. It felt safe. That night he cooked beans and cornbread while she rocked the baby by the fire. The warmth seeped into her bones, melting away the cold years of loneliness. For the first time in what felt like forever, she laughed softly when the baby reached for the cowboy's hat, tugging at the brim with tiny fists. The cowboy chuckled, low and warm, handing the hat over. "Reckon it suits him better than me," he said. The sound of their laughter, gentle, unforced, echoed in the cabin, filling the space with life. Days turned into weeks. She learned to mend fences, to cook hearty meals with what little they had, to milk the old cow in the barn. He taught her how to ride, steadying her hands on the reins while the baby watched from the fence rail. Giggling, the ranch became more than his home, it became theirs, and little by little the cracks in her heart began to mend. She no longer woke each night in fear of hunger or cold. The baby no longer cried himself to sleep. She had someone to lean on, someone who showed her every day, in quiet ways, that she and her child mattered. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange across the horizon, she stood outside the cabin, the baby asleep in her arms. The cowboy came up beside her, his hands resting on the fence rail, his gaze on the sky. "You saved us," she said softly, breaking the silence. He shook his head. "You were already stronger than you knew. All I did was give you a hand when you needed it." She turned to him, her heart swelling with words she had held back for too long. "You gave me more than that. You gave me hope again." The cowboy met her gaze, and for a moment neither spoke. The prairie was quiet, the only sound the rustle of grass in the evening breeze. Then slowly, he reached out and touched her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke louder than any vow. In that touch, she felt the promise of tomorrow, not just survival, but living. Not just existing, but building a life. The baby stirred slightly, sighing in his sleep, and she smiled down at him. When she lifted her eyes again, the cowboy was still watching her, his expression soft, almost vulnerable. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said quietly, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that he was right. The night settled over them, but it was no longer heavy or frightening. For the first time in years, it felt like a blanket, warm, protective, full of promise. The widow, once broken and lost, had found not just safety but a future, and the cowboy, once wandering and restless, had found what he hadn't known he was searching for, a home filled with laughter, trust, and the chance to love again. Together, they stood beneath the wide prairie sky, no longer strangers, no longer lost. Just a woman, a cowboy, and a child who would never cry from hunger again.